Welcome to Liveable Kirkland's author talk this evening with Anna Zivarts. My name is Jenny Yeager, and I'm on the leadership team of Liveable Kirkland, which is the organizer of this event tonight. This is a public event that is being video recorded and photographed. The video recording will be made available after the event. So despite what some may be expecting, this event is not a discussion of Kirkland's comprehensive plan. It is an educational program that will focus on the work of Anna Zivarts. Please send any comments you may have about the comp plan directly to the city. So let's see. Here's our agenda. We'll start by introducing the sponsoring organizations, then have our author speak, followed by Q&A, and then have time for socializing. Liveable Kirkland is the organizer of today's educational event. Liveable Kirkland is a social and civic organization run by volunteers. Our membership comes from every neighborhood of Kirkland, including renters and homeowners, and including all ages, students, working people, parents, and retirees. We strongly support the city's vision for an inclusive Kirkland. We believe everyone who spends their days in Kirkland should be able to call Kirkland home. To achieve this vision while improving sustainability and quality of life, we need more housing choices for all in people-oriented, complete communities, interconnected with efficient transportation. Part of being inclusive means making our city accessible to people of all abilities. Liveable Kirkland hosts 7 to 9 meetups per month, sometimes with candidates for office or other special guests. Drop in and join us on the Cross Kirkland corridor, rain or shine, for coffee, tea, and muffins any Wednesday morning, including Christmas and New Year's Day this year. Book club. We have a lively monthly discussion in our Urbanism Book Club. Next book for discussion will be Neighborhood Defenders, Participatory Politics and America's Housing Crisis on January 8th. For busy people with no time to read a whole book, view video summaries on our book club page. You don't have to read the book to learn from the discussion. Bike valet. We have opportunities for volunteering, including in our bike valet program, which runs in the warmer months and is like a coat check for your bike, your scooter, your stroller, or even your kayak during events in Kirkland, like festivals and farmers markets, where both car and bike parking may be scarce. Keep an eye on our calendar, public calendar, Facebook page, Discord meetup, or email newsletters to find out about our events, such as meetups, group bike rides, hikes, or guest speakers. On this particular bike ride on the CKC, the line of cyclists stretched from horizon to horizon. In addition to community building, social and recreational events, we host educational events like tonight. We strongly believe in a community for all of us. After the presentation, please visit the sponsoring group information tables to find out about how to get more involved. We have a Liveable Kirkland table there and another one over here where people will be available to speak with you. And now I'll turn over the mic to another sponsor representative, Anna Cavender. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, my name is Anna Cavender, and I want to tell you about 2 other community affiliations for this talk. The first is Accessibility Seattle, which is a group for tech professionals who are working to make products and services more accessible for people with disabilities. And the other one is Disability Connect, which is a group of industry professionals in the disability community who come together to support each other, encourage each other, share experiences, and learn and grow. And if you'd like to learn more about those, we're going to have a table in the back at the end. Also, at the end of Anna's talk, we're going to have a Q&A session. We're aiming for about 30 minutes. See how that goes. If you would like to submit a question, you can do that in two ways. One is you can write your question down on a 4x6 card that you can obtain from the registration table, or you can use this QR code to enter your question into a Google form. Either way, we will try to address your questions about Anna, about Anna's book, or about Anna's work at the end. And now I'll hand it over to Bev Marcus to introduce our author, Anna Zivarts.
Thank you, Anna. And I'm Bev Marcus, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Anna Zivarts. Anna Zivarts is a low-vision parent, non-driver, and author of When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency, published by Island Press in 2024. Anna launched the Week Without Driving Challenge and directs the Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington, where she organizes to bring the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policy-making tables. Anna's book drew me in with its engaging writing style and storytelling format, where she shares real-life mobility experiences and challenges. With each story, I gained a richer understanding of these challenges, how non-drivers need what everyone needs, and ideas on what we can do now to start steering away from car dependency. And with that, I'd like us to give a very warm welcome to Anna Zivarts.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Bev. Thanks all the hosts. Thanks, City of Kirkland. And thanks, Bob, my tech guy, or the city's tech guy, for making this all work tonight. Really appreciate it. I want to start with an introduction about where I came from, why I wrote this book, and who I am. So you can see I'm carrying a white cane, and that's just a reminder to you all, I am low vision, so I can't see you very well right now. So if you are trying to get my attention, that's why I have some great volunteers here who are going to help with the Q&A sections and the interactive sections of this panel to make sure that we hear your voices and that we can interact. But right now, as I look at it, you all, I see, basically a blur of faces and people with name tags that I can't read. So I was born with an eye condition called nystagmus, and that makes my eyes shake a little bit like this all the time. It's a neurological condition, and it means that I don't see well enough to drive, and among other things. But I grew up in Olympia, outside of Olympia, actually, in sort of more rural part of Thurston County. The image on the upper right of the screen is the road that my parents live on, and it's in the woods. It's a narrow road, no sidewalks. There's no bus service. There's no shoulder. And I, thought that everyone who was an adult drove to get around. I really couldn't imagine other sorts of navigation. And the picture and the big picture on the screen right now, that's a picture of me as a kid. You can see I have big, thick glasses. I do bike, and I think that's sort of unusual or unexpected for folks who are blind and low vision. But there actually are quite a few of us who are able to bike safely, even though we can't see well enough to drive a car. And this is a picture of me in Tumwater at my friend's house where there were sidewalks, and I was very, very envious of her because we could ride bikes around her neighborhood, and not where I grew up. So anyway, as a high school student, I went to the DMV. I tried to pass a vision test. I didn't. I couldn't, and I still was determined to learn how to drive. And I had a friend try to teach me how to drive in the parking lot at Evergreen College. Which, if any of you have ever been there, Evergreen is in the woods, and the parking lot has all these really big trees, like between the rows of where you can park cars. And I drove her mom's truck up a tree. And yeah, it wasn't great. It was night. It was raining. Like, we should not have been driving her mom's truck. I definitely should not have been driving her mom's truck. Yeah, luckily we were okay. I spent the summer working for her mom, trying to pay off the damage we did to the truck, clearing blackberries. So that wasn't great. But my friend and I we're still friends. She now works for the city, or she works up in Port Townsend for the county, doing climate work, and had me up this summer to talk about the book. So it's a small world. And we're still friends. But that moment really actually was helpful because it scared me. And it made me realize that driving was never going to be a safe option for me. And luckily, no one got hurt in that process. So this picture on the bottom right of the screen is New York City. And that's where I moved after college because I had heard that there was a subway that ran, and it ran 24 hours a day there. And I was like, that is the world I want to live in. I want to live somewhere where I have the same mobility as everyone else. And I lived in New York City for close to 15 years. And then I had a kid in 2016, and I, decided that I wanted to be closer to family. My folks are still down in Olympia. My brother actually was living in Kirkland at the time. He lived here for around 10 years, now lives in Redmond. My in-laws were here in Washington State too. And so we moved back to Washington State in 2018. And I got a job working at Disability Rights Washington. And that's where, for the first time in my adult life, I met other disabled folks who were openly disabled. And I also got to meet other folks who couldn't drive and couldn't drive because of disabilities. And that was really affirming to me, really exciting, because I felt for the first time that I wasn't alone. I had felt, in New York, it was normal not to drive, but knowing that there were other adults in Washington State who got around without driving was really exciting for me. And so as the pandemic started, I got permission to launch a project which is called the Disability Mobility Initiative, where we did a big amount of story collecting from folks all over Washington State who couldn't drive and couldn't afford to drive. And at first we started out with folks who were disabled and couldn't drive because of their disabilities. But very quickly it became hard to sort of draw a line between, is someone not able to drive because they can't afford to or because they're disabled? Like where do you draw that line? And so we decided to include everyone who couldn't drive. And we made it a point of making sure that we had stories from every legislative district in the state, so that when we went to elected leaders and particularly folks down in Olympia to our legislature and asked them for more funding for sidewalks or for transit, they couldn't say, oh, well, no one in my district needs that. Everyone in my district drives. When we could say, well, here, there's a person right here who you can meet in this conversation and hear their story about how they would really love sidewalks in Yakima, for example. So this is an image of that story map that we worked on. I think it has close to 300 stories in it now. And there's an image here on the screen as well as my colleague and I, Abby, doing some outreach at an event in Kent where we were talking to folks who had recently immigrated from mostly Afghanistan and Iraq at an event with Liveable Kent, and had a lot of families there who needed better transit, needed more access to their communities. So we're going to do a little interactive bit now. I want to have you think about, in your own life, in your own social circles, whether that's your family or people on your block, people perhaps who go to community events that you go to, schools, perhaps your extended family, maybe it's your parents or grandparents who can't drive or can't afford to drive, and maybe that's you. And what your or their experience is of getting around. So I'll model this real quick, and then we're going to call on some folks to share. So in my life, it's in my household, it's me, and also I have an 8-year-old who was puking all last night, but that's another story. I'm actually very relieved to be here today and not dealing with that. My partner does drive. My parents are aging out of driving. They're down in Olympia. My dad's 80. And yeah, it's rough because they are far out of transit service. And so, that's a difficult conversation to have. So that's sort of my immediate social circle. On my block, this is a picture of the bus of my son and another kid on the block riding the bus. There's a lot of kids on my block. And there's also a lot of folks who are aging out of driving, who live on my block as well. So, let's hear it from some folks from the audience who want to share who in your lives doesn't drive, chooses not to drive, can't afford to drive, is aging out of driving.
Hi, thank you for coming today.
Yeah.
My sister lives in Stockholm and she is low vision, legally blind. She has retinitis pigmentosa. She has 2 kids. She hasn't been able to drive in about 15 years or something, but she rides a bike like you. She travels a lot for work. She's going to Berlin this week for a conference. She takes her white cane. So I'm impressed and surprised all the time hearing the range of things that she can do given her limitations.
That's cool. I'm excited. My next project, I think, is be around low vision folks who bike, because I feel like there's so much, there's just a lot of stories out there that we don't hear. All right, let's hear from someone else.
I'm the runner.
Yes, and thanks for being my runner.
I'm Kathleen, and I have a 29-year-old son who had cancer when he was 2, and he has compressive optic neuropathy and some other neurological issues. He can't drive, he bikes, and he gets around on an e-trike, and it's been amazing. So for the last, 10 years, 15 years, he's been fully independent on his e-trike and combined with transit. So we live in the center of Seattle, so it's easy for us.
That's awesome. And oh my gosh, the new sort of availability of e-trikes and the lower cost options that are starting to be out there, I think is so exciting. Yeah, and I think really can and is opening up mobility for more folks, which is great. Thanks for sharing. All right, let's do a couple more.
Hi, I'm 15 and therefore cannot legally drive. I'm too young. And yeah, I get around mostly with my parents. They drive me places. I sometimes take the bus. Kind of sucks. That's, yeah.
Cool. Yes, young people are non-drivers. I love to hear your stories.
One more. Here we go.
All right, one more. And then we'll keep going.
Hi, my friend, one of my best friends, her family is not quite low income, but barely making it on the east side, as a lot of people are, and they can only afford to have one car, and so they have to live as far out in Issaquah as possible, and so it's extremely hard for her to get any sort of transit from there, and so she's pretty much homebound until her husband can stay home from work and she can use the car, and it's friends like myself and my friend Brian here can't go out, can't see her as often, or, I have to go out to visit her more often, which is totally fine, and I'm happy to accommodate, but it makes it very limited for her to have a vibrant, diverse life, being able to get out around the east side.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I think that's such a thing that we don't think about or measure, right? In the census, we look at, household vehicle, how many vehicles per household, but not how many people within that household then need to go places. And so if there's one vehicle, right, where does that vehicle go and who has access to who doesn't? So such an important and, important and often invisible, I think, part of the transportation conversation. So you guys all covered many of these, but I just want to go over some of the broad categories of non-drivers in our communities, and recognizing that these categories are often overlapping, and they're not strict binaries either. And this first story I'm going to share sort of is an example of that. There's an image of Erica, and she is a power chair user who lives in Seattle now. For a long time, she lived up in Snohomish County. But she can drive a car, but she can't afford a vehicle that is wheelchair accessible. And so if she drives somewhere, she can't get out of the vehicle. She's, stuck in the vehicle. And so for her, transit really is, mobility, because then she's able to go, outside of the vehicle more than just a drive-through sort of situation. So, Erica is a non-driver. It's also, for many folks, there's all kinds of disabilities that can prevent driving or driving safely. And sometimes those disabilities are, fixed, like my disability. I will always be low vision. It's not going to change. I will never be a driver. But, for some folks, they were perhaps drivers at different parts of their lives, or they have a chronic health condition where some days they can drive and other days they can't. Maybe a mental health condition where some months it's okay to drive and other times it's just not really safe. And I think there's also a lot of folks who have severe anxiety or PTSD around driving, where maybe if they really have to drive, they can, but they don't want to or prefer to, or maybe they can't drive at all. And they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves disabled. But, that anxiety is something that is very, very much part of their lives and shapes where they're able to get to, and really shapes their mobility. There's also a lot of older folks who I think wouldn't consider themselves disabled, but for whom it is no longer safe to drive. My mom can't really drive at night anymore. And that's tricky, especially this time of year when she wants to come out and help with after school activities with my kid, but it's dark. And so I really don't want her to. This image on the bottom left of the screen is my grandma, who lived in southern Indiana. She's passed away now, but she had a heart condition towards the end of her life that caused her to pass out. And she really didn't want to give up driving because it would mean that she had to leave the farm where she lived and where all her animals were that she loved a lot. She had a gazillion dogs that she would like to rescue. And she kept driving, and she would periodically pass out while driving, drive off the side of the road. But this is very, very rural southern Indiana where there was nothing to hit. And so she would, wake up in the ditch, or someone would find her in the ditch, right? Yeah, and she did that until, she passed away, and luckily never hurt anyone. But she would never have considered herself disabled, right? And then, I think for many people, driving is, because our communities are so car dependent, the choices are hard, right? Because she didn't want to have to go live in an assisted living facility just because she couldn't drive and give up, so much of what was important to her. So there's also young people, right? And I'm glad we have young people in the audience today. This picture on the upper right of the screen is my kid and another kid on the block waiting for the school bus. And I think, often we discount the mobility of young folks and we say, okay, well, they're under the age of 16, so, they'll be adults soon and then they'll be able to drive. That isn't true for all young people. That won't be true for my son. He is also low vision. And even if they can't drive themselves, they should still need to go places. And we recognize that when we fund school bus systems, right? Where we say, okay, maybe, kids can't get there themselves. They may not always have someone in their family who can drive them. We still value their access to school. So we're going to fund this service. And so I think it's important for us to include kids and young people when we talk about mobility access and we talk about non-drivers in our communities. And then finally, and these are all sort of, the big percentage of non-drivers in all of our communities are folks who can't afford to drive or can't afford, a vehicle for every adult in the household, every driver. And we saw this became super visible during the pandemic when, the bus routes that had a lot of choice transit riders, that ridership really disappeared. But bus routes like the 7 in Rainier Valley, and this is image in the middle of the screen from the 7, during the middle of the pandemic, those ridership numbers really stayed up there. And that's because people didn't have another choice. And we know that Black households and immigrant households in the US are much less likely to have access to cars, and low-income households as well because of the cost of car ownership. And so folks who can't afford cars or whose licenses have been suspended because they can't afford fines and fees around traffic tickets, those are a big percentage of non-drivers. And then finally, the last category, this I think is again there's not a concrete distinction between choice and not choice always, but there are choice or voluntary non-drivers. People for whom can afford to live somewhere where there is great transit, where there are great sidewalks, where getting around is really safe and comfortable. Maybe they enjoy biking and there's good biking infrastructure. Choice non-drivers are also part of this. There's also, folks who maybe it's kind of a choice, right? Like they would rather, they don't make a lot of money and they would rather have that money for housing or for other things in their life than paying for a car. And there's an image here on the right of some young people riding the bus in Seattle. And I think, for young people, the statistics are really interesting for Gen Z. When I was a teenager, around 50% of 16-year-olds in the US had driver's licenses. And now it's around 25%. So big decrease, right? In the number of young people either choosing to or being able to afford to drive. And so that's another, community of non-drivers. So altogether, non-drivers in Washington state make up about 30% of the population. And this is, around in the US, about 30% of the population doesn't have a driver's license. We don't have other good national data on this. Wisconsin has done research and around 31% of their population are non-drivers. So we think this is a pretty reliable number. This is from a study that was done by Tool Design, released in 2023. It was by the legislature here in Washington state called for this study. And so there's some research here. If you want to see that, you can dig in. If you Google JTC non-driver study, the Joint Transportation Committee in the legislature published this study. These are some maps of Washington state showing which counties or which census tracts have the highest percentage of non-drivers and also the highest number of non-drivers. And I think what's important to note here is that, sure, there's some big urban areas where those numbers are high, but there's also very rural parts of our state, tribal communities, and places where there are a lot of low-income folks who are not driving or aging out of driving. And so recognizing that it's not just people living in Capitol Hill and Seattle who are choosing not to drive when we talk about non-drivers in our state. So how do non-drivers get around? How are we accessing our communities? What this study from Tool Design showed, and also what we've seen in our interviews here in Washington and what I hear, when I talk to other folks around the country, is that the reality is that because of so many of our communities are so car dependent, most often we're getting rides from other people because there isn't good transit, because there aren't connected sidewalks, because there aren't safe places to walk or roll or ride. And this comes at a cost. There's an emotional burden to asking someone for a ride somewhere. And so just thinking about in your own life, if you are someone who drives, there's probably been a time recently where you've had to ask for a ride. Maybe it was to the airport or to a doctor's appointment or for some other reason. And sort of considering how that felt. Did you feel like you owed that person? What did you have to trade them? There's an image here. This is me and my dad. Sometimes there's places in this state I have to go. I'm wearing a work t-shirt in this picture where I can't get to. And I think here he was driving me out to the Wishkah Valley and outside of Aberdeen for a trip. I definitely felt like I owed him, even though he's my dad. And I feel the same way with my partner too when I have to ask for rides. And there's a quote here. I'm going to read it. This is from a non-driver, and I'm going to turn this way because I can read that big text. She says, "Even though my friends and family and my husband see how hard it is for me, I'm sure that they don't get it. They'll say, 'Oh, just give me a call. I'll give you a ride.' That could be 6 times a day. You don't really mean that." That's a quote from Joni. So recognizing that while, if you have a good social network, it can be possible to access that for rides. It does come with a price, and it doesn't give you the kind of mobility that being able to grab your keys and go does. And if you don't have that social network, or say perhaps, you're in a situation in a household where for whatever reason, you can't ask for that trip or that particular trip to a doctor's appointment or wherever, it can be a safety issue as well. And so how do we move beyond that? How do we give non-drivers options? Transit is a big one. And we're lucky that we all live here in King County where we have really invested in transit. And so, as much as I sometimes complain about how long it takes to get places on the bus, you can get most places in King County on the bus. The same is not true for Pierce County, right? The same is not true for so much of our state. There's an image here of Abby Griffith. She's a blind non-driver I've worked with. She grew up in Ridgefield, which is outside of north of Vancouver a little bit. And it's seen a lot of growth. So now actually there's starting to be some transit service there. But as she grew up there, like me, she grew up in a place there was no transit, right? And so she had a single mom and a lot of siblings. And so she felt like she couldn't ask her mom for rides. And so she was stuck at home through a lot of her teenage years. It made her feel really depressed, really isolated. When she was finally able to get her own apartment in Vancouver, Washington, she was thrilled because it gave her that freedom to go meet friends whenever she wanted, go to the grocery store, go grab coffee. And she says, the room I rented was right next to the bus number 30. It was life-changing for me to know that I could access places. So just considering what you know about your own street, your own block, your own community, where does transit go? Where does it not go? How frequently does it run? When does it stop running? Does it run on weekends? Just thinking about that in your own life. If you're trying to get home, say today from this event, could you do that? Probably in King County you can, which is great. But it is, not everywhere has that access. The other piece of this is, right, if you don't have a connected sidewalk or an accessible sidewalk to access that transit stop, it may as well not exist, especially if you're in a wheelchair or you're blind or low vision and you need that to access transit. There's an image here of Tanisha Sepulveda. She's a power chair user who lives in South Seattle. And she, is in this image, she's rolling in the street to get from her apartment to the bus stop because there aren't curb ramps. And where there are curb ramps, the sidewalk is really cracked and lifted and bumped. And if she tries to roll over it, her chair she'll flip. And, Seattle is a city that has a lot of resources. We still have $5 billion worth of unbuilt sidewalks and sidewalks that are inaccessible because of cracks and bumps and missing curb ramps. And so there's so much work to do here. There's also, the issue of crossing, like how it is, maybe there's a sidewalk to get to that bus stop, but say you need to cross the street there. Is it a safe and comfortable place to be able to cross? And this other image on the screen is an intersection I've been picking on Seattle about for a long time, but this is, I'm sure you all have been here. It's the intersection of Rainier and I-90. Yes. And we're building a light rail station right there, which hopefully, had it been open today, it would have been really easy for me to get here. But alas. So there is going to be a light rail station there. It's going to be one of the busiest transit points in the King County network, because people are going to be transferring from north-south buses to the light rail. And yet we have these on and off ramps from I-90. And so if you're a pedestrian or you're a cyclist, you have to cross these off and on ramps where people are going really fast. So that's just one pretty gnarly example, but I'm sure you can think of lots of examples in your own community of places where there are bus stops and there may not be safe or accessible places to cross, or maybe there is a crossing, but it involves crossing a lot of lanes with a lot of high-speed traffic or turning traffic, and it can feel super uncomfortable. So I'm going to read a quote from Tanisha, and she says, "It is even less safe for me to be on the sidewalk where the curb cuts are not in place, or there are dips in the cement, or roots have lifted off the sidewalk or gravel." So that's why she's rolling in the street there. And Tanisha's been doored. I don't know how many people here bike. Yeah. And I've been doored on a bike. It's awful. She was doored in her power chair and flipped and ended up in the hospital. So yeah, these things have safety implications for all of us when our sidewalks aren't connected and aren't accessible. And I don't have a picture on this screen, but one thing I talk about a lot, and I'm sure there's places like this in this part in Kitsap. There's definitely places in Kitsap County. I'm sure there's places in King County. The picture I have is from Kitsap County, and it shows two people waiting for a bus. And there's a bus stop, but it's loose gravel. And so the people are waiting, someone's in a power chair, and she's waiting out in the street on this rural road, high-speed rural road, because she can't get off the street into the gravel because she'll get stuck or she'll tip. And so, really thinking about what are our bus stops like? Are there benches? Are there shelters? Is there lighting? Is there a platform even, right? Is there a way to get off of the street and wait safely? So yeah, thinking about all these things in your own neighborhood, and the places you go. What are the bus stops like? What are the crossings like? Is there a connected sidewalk? Are there curb ramps? Are we still waiting for those things? The last sort of big picture issue I want to touch on is land use and zoning, because our region is increasingly unaffordable to folks who are low income, especially disabled folks. And so we get priced further and further out. And what that means is that we are priced further and further away, like the story from Issaquah, right? Further away from transit, and further away from sidewalks. And this image here is a blind person. This is Greg. He lives in Longview, Washington. And he was walking me from his house to the nearest Walmart. And in this image, there's no sidewalks. And it's a I-5 on-ramp. So it's just, not a comfortable or fun place to be as a pedestrian. And there were not accessible pedestrian signals in this area either. And so he would just have to wait and kind of try to guess about gaps in traffic and when it was safe to cross. There's a quote here also from Vaughn Brown, who's another non-driver. He now lives in Spokane. He was priced out of the Vancouver area. And he says, more affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation. So just thinking about in your own life, where are the places that you need to go? Where are those in relationship to where you live? And what are the experiences like getting to those places? Which places are easier? Which places are harder? And then if you couldn't drive, what would those places be like? What would be options to get to, and what wouldn't be? So I want to get into solutions a little bit, and then we'll get into some questions and another interactive bit actually first. The first is really thinking about that. As a non-driver, if you were to experience your community, what would it be like? And there's an image here. This is in Vancouver, Washington, actually right outside of Vancouver in Clark County, where some folks are waiting for the bus. And we'd walk there on a road without sidewalks, so we were in the mud. And there's a quote here from Ivanova, who's a non-driver, and she says, "Legislators don't understand the pain and agony of standing in the rain at the bus stop or having to be stuck at a crosswalk and missing your bus. Can you imagine waiting in the rain another hour, waiting for the next bus?" And so it's this sort of reason that we at Disability Rights Washington in 2021 created the Week Without Driving Challenge, because we really wanted legislators in particular, but all decision makers, and actually everyone in our communities, to think more about what it would be like to be a non-driver and what your access and your transportation experience would be. So the way the Week Without Driving Challenge works, and I know you all are I know Kirkland Greenways was part of this the original year in 2021. I know many of you in this room have heard about it. But basically the idea is that every trip counts, right? We're not just talking about commute trips. This is about all those other trips too. I've been, for the last couple of weeks, been editing video footage from this year's exit interviews with elected leaders, and soccer practice seems to be the #1 reason people are struggling with this challenge, right? It's all those other trips. It's the getting kids places, it's getting to the doctor's appointments, it's getting to the grocery store, it's meeting friends after work. And the idea is that you can't drive yourself, but you can still get rides. You can do all the things that non-drivers do. You can ask for rides from friends and family. If you can afford to, you can pay for rides. And then you can walk, you can roll, you can take transit, you can try to reschedule, you can try to do things remote, all the ways that we sort of figure out how to, continue to participate in our communities. And we really ask elected leaders to sort of reflect on their privilege in this, because sure, if you live in Capitol Hill, this could be relatively easy. If you're someone who can bike, and biking is a comfortable thing for you, then, and it's beautiful sunny weather, biking for a week without driving, could be quite enjoyable. But that's not necessarily the experience of someone living in Longview, or someone who, is in a power wheelchair. And so really reflecting on what gives you access to the world that you live in. And then we also ask people to think of it, not so much as a challenge, but really like, how can this help you understand the experiences of non-drivers? And so if you need to drive for certain trips, that's fine, right? It's not like a test, it's not a pass-fail, but really using it as a way to build your understanding and understand where there's gaps and understand how you could make things better in your community as someone who is either, someone in elected office or someone who works at an agency, or just a member of the general public who can stand up and support these things that are going to make our communities more inclusive. So I'm going to open it up again for a few more audience. What I want to prompt you with is to talk about your own experience of Week Without Driving, if it's a challenge, if you participated previously, or if you haven't, what you imagine a week would be like for you, where those barriers would be, where are the places that would be most difficult to get to, what trips you might have to give up, and what, your relative privilege in all of this, how that impacts those things. So let's take a couple, if anyone is willing to be brave and share.
Hey, yeah, my name is Christopher. Nice to meet you all. I just have a couple different themes of thoughts based on your presentation. But the first one that came to mind was when I first moved to Seattle, so my disability is I have hearing loss, so I don't have any sort of like mobility related disability. But I used public transportation for the first 3 years I lived in Seattle until I started getting into hiking. But there's a bus system that takes you up to I forget the Mount Si, but after that, like the deeper nature trails, you got to have a car. And so that was like when I first got a car. But it made me kind of take that step back and realize, like what are some of those pain points for people who have mobility disabilities and can't access certain things in their own city. And I was like, I feel so privileged to be able to like go anywhere I want by walking and by, driving now. But, I think that was one. The other one that I thought about recently was when you were talking about like the ramp system and like how people can't access transportation. I've noticed that on Thursdays and Fridays, the city does like garbage collection, and they'll put the garbage bins like right on the sidewalk. And so I find myself kind of like snaking through my entire block and taking that step back again and going, wow, so I've been like trying to clear it up like every single time, but that's just an example of like a burden that people have to face of not being able to access that sidewalk, and it's actually been designed correctly. So those are just some rambling thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. No, I want to respond to both those. I think the access to the outdoors here is so such a big thing because it's such a lifestyle thing for so many people in this region. And yet, yeah, there's really not much transit. One of my colleagues at Disability Rights Washington started a sort of an advocacy organization called Transit Trucker that's specifically about how to access the outdoors in Washington State using transit and a combination of transit and biking. And she has created these guides. You can look it up. It's Transit Trucker. It's still hard. And, especially if you have a kid, like the amount of time it takes then to use transit to get somewhere is like, oh man, how do you do this? So, and then also, yeah, the garbage can piece. I mean, yeah, you think about garbage cans, sometimes the lime scooters or the scooter shares that get parked in the wrong places, A-frame signs, bushes that people just kind of let grow out over the sidewalk. And I have some rosemary at my house that's kind of does that sometimes if I'm not careful. But yeah, those are all, all of that. And I think someone I was talking to who was a chair user was telling me like sidewalks are our highways, right? Like we need to be able to get places, in the same way that we wouldn't tolerate these kind of obstructions on a highway, we should think about our sidewalks that same way. All right, let's do another one or two shares if anyone else is willing for Week Without Driving reflections.
Yes. Okay. So Bailey, first name, last name Fuentes. I did have a question about the biking Monday through Friday for the 1 week. You were talking about it in terms of the prompt. I really enjoyed the East Rail in terms of accessibility. If you're traveling from, say, Wilburton or, any part of like Southern Bellevue, that line going from there into Kirkland is actually a really essential part of transportation. So I would definitely say Monday through Friday in terms of like traveling around from there to here, that would be one of the good parts of it. I think the barrier for me would be just the weather. No one's going to want to bike in, freezing and sliding temperatures like that. And I think if that's the only thing in Washington, that'd be the only barrier. It rains half the year anyways, but I do enjoy that. I think that would be my main piece to add.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the East Trail is amazing. And the Kirkland Connector, I am so jealous of the East Side and your bike trails, I have to say. If I could move over here, I would. Because there really are those off street bike access and rolling access points that are so low stress and really, just getting built out in such a wonderful way. So that is really an awesome way. And I hope we can make sure that there's the lighting and stuff to make them, available for people who are using them. Not just for recreation, but, we need to get places in the dark as well. But yeah, super jealous. It's something I wish we had more places. All right, one more. Do we have one more?
Thank you. I'm Dylan. I participated in the Week Without Driving this last year, and there were two things that really stood out to me. The first one is how lucky I am to have access to the Cross Kirkland corridor. That is makes daily errands so easy. It just involves a little bit more forward planning. And then the second thing that I think was my biggest takeaway was how difficult it makes some professions to access. I work as a real estate agent, so frequently I'm having to drive other clients around or meet clients at properties. And if I'm in a day touring just more than 2 properties with a client, if I tried to do that same trip by transit, it would be upwards of 4 hours sometimes. And so someone who doesn't have access to a car, there are complete professions that aren't available to them. And so during that week, I would not have been able to perform my job if I didn't have access to a car. And I'm sure there's other professions out there like that, but I noticed that was a unique barrier that I hadn't thought of previously.
Thank you. Yeah, that is actually the perfect transition to where I want to go next. So before I do, really quick, Week Without Driving, just a quick history. It started here in Washington State. We launched it at Disability Rights Washington in 2021. We just had our 4th year. And in 2023, it became a national campaign. In partnership with America Walks. And this year, I think we had over 400 organizations from all 50 states co-hosting. So there's an image here of some of the cool logos of some of those organizations that got their logos to us. And then the other image here is just something that I am particularly excited about. But in Toledo, Ohio, the transit agency there really ran with Week Without Driving as a way to highlight their service. And King County Metro here actually helped sponsor the event as well. So shout out to King County. But in Toledo, they did a bus wrap where they wrapped an entire bus and they put the Week Without Driving logo on it. And then they had all these statistics around non-drivers and about community access. And it was just really cool. I got to go to Toledo a couple of weeks ago and meet the bus in person, which was pretty neat. But this is TARTA is the transit agency there. If you want to follow them on social, this is their LinkedIn account. But going back to this issue of, how our expectations around certain jobs and how that might exclude people who can't drive. And I want to talk about this in particular in the context of elected office. And there's actually a Kirkland council member who is quoted in my book, and I think is someone who started thinking about this before I even thought about this. But really that expectation that you're supposed to be a lot of places and be a lot of places quickly, that is true for elected leaders. I'm going to read, this is Councilmember Neil Black's quote. He says, "It's kind of hard to imagine how someone who didn't have access to a car could do the job of city council member. Our expectations are to be in a lot of different places and a lot of different times. In a suburban city like ours, it's a challenge to do that without driving. And that means there's a large segment of our population excluded from serving in this role." And what that means is, we often lack the voices of people who can't drive or can't afford to drive in policymaking decisions and roles. And we see this most concretely in our transit agency boards, where in Washington State, most transit agencies are run through a structure called PTBAs, Public Transit Benefit Associations, and those members are set by state law and they are elected officials from the region. And so what that means is we don't have folks, if it's only elected officials running these transit agencies, often we don't have people on transit agencies that have the experience of being riders. And so for the last 2 years, Disability Rights Washington, that's 3 years actually, has been working on legislation to try to change that. And one of our biggest allies was another person who participated in Week Without Driving, Councilmember Lindsay Schwerman Warren. It's a mouthful of a name, but he's been a tremendous ally. He lives up in Port Angeles and is on the Clallam Council Board. And there's an image here of him testifying in the legislature last year in support of this legislation. And he says, "Most of our board members are not frequent transit riders. We recognize the direct stake that riders have in public transit. This is a simple policy that ensures nothing about us without us." And so we will be, I wanted to end this my presentation with some concrete actions that you all can take. And I know Liveable Kirkland's also going to add some stuff from the work that they're doing here. But from the perspective of Disability Rights Washington, I wanted to share a few examples of legislation that is happening in the state legislature this coming session in January that you can track and support if you're interested. So one is on this transit rider representation bill. That we're hoping to have 2 members added to transit board statewide, and those members would be community members who are transit riders. And so that's legislation we'd really love to see move forward to really just make sure that we have that perspective. And this is particularly important in communities that are actively anti-tax and anti-transit and actively working to try to cut transit funding. And then on those boards, we just completely lack the perspective of people who rely on transit. The other piece of legislation that we're really excited about is around driver's license requirements for jobs. And this is cool. I think so on Wednesday, the governor signed a couple of executive orders around disability employment. And one of them talks about driver's license and other sort of credentials that people with disabilities disproportionately do not have and therefore are excluded from state employment. And so what we're trying to do in the legislature is actually a little different than that. It's not just for state employment, but also for private employers as well, to mirror legislation that happened that was passed in 2021 in Oregon and this fall in California that basically prohibits private employers from requiring driver's licenses for jobs when driving isn't an essential function. It's kind of a mouthful. But yeah, what we see, and often this is actually transit agencies, And other places where it would be really helpful to have the perspective of people who rely on transit, we see them creating these job postings that require a driver's license. And I'm not talking about, the bus driver jobs. Obviously, you want someone with a CDL for those. You do not want me driving your bus. But there are lots of planning jobs, right, around transit service, understanding the needs of riders, where it would really help to have someone who actually relies on transit in those roles. And then we also just have huge disparities of employment access and our underemployment in the disability community. And this is part of the desire to address that and ensure that we all have the chance to make our communities better and more inclusive. So I'm going to end there, pass it to Anna, and do some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Anna. This is really great for highlighting the problems that we face and giving sort of an optimistic view of concrete solutions. This is really great. Now we are opening it to Q&A. As a reminder, there are two ways to ask your question. You can write it on a 4x6 card and, oh great, we have them lined up. I do have one question. Sure. Thanks. From the Google form. This one is from Lauren Hall-Stigert. Steigert. Took a stab, got it wrong. And the question is, what is the most effective way to advocate for more King County Metro funding so that we can expand bus service?
Oh my gosh. That is a great question. Funding for everything in our state is tricky right now, I think, because of our tax structure. I know that, the Climate Commitment Act, first of all, we're really excited that Initiative 2117 didn't pass because that really would have put in jeopardy a lot of transit funding, both here in King County and throughout the state. So, making sure, but then now I think because that climate commitment funding is there, what I have heard and that we have big deficits in other areas of our state budget, there's the desire to sort of take that climate commitment funding and use it for other things. And so making sure that transit funding piece of that doesn't get cut. So these are almost sort of defensive things, right? Versus proactive. But, I think the thinking about more progressive revenue sources is a big piece. And then right as the pandemic started, before the pandemic, I was involved in a King County Metro work group where we were thinking about, how would we equitably expand transit service throughout King County? And there was discussion of going to, the ballot with a transit ballot measure for King County. The pandemic started, it didn't happen. And then there's so I think there's a question of when that can happen next. And pushing folks, on council to raise that question, to push for it, to set things up so that we can actually increase that funding. So that's part of it. I think the other part is just riding transit and encouraging everyone to ride transit and showing that there is the ridership, that there is the demand. Yeah.
The next question. For my work, I advocate for infrastructure in Pioneer Square and Chinatown International District. How do you suggest can we make SDOT be better? Specifically, it is a system that seems to lack transparency or any understanding of how to listen and incorporate needs of transit-dependent people.
Oh my gosh, yeah, our office is down in that area, and it does feel so hard to make change with stuff. I don't know. There's so many projects, right, that need funding, and it feels like often things, there's just not the funding to do the things we need to do. I feel hopeless a lot with City of Seattle politics, so I have a hard time answering that one. I know there are really good folks within SDOT who are trying really hard. I also, that's a tricky question. I think, I was excited that we got a transportation levy passed in Seattle, and that will hopefully put some funding in place. I think one part of that, we intentionally, when we were working with council to advocate for how that levy would be structured. And this is we as Disability Rights Washington. We're pushing really hard for all the sidewalk funding to be front-loaded in the first 4 years of the levy, so that they would have to come up with additional revenue for all the sidewalk improvements going forward. And part of the discussions are that they are supposed to create a work group to look at additional revenue sources, because we have that, like, it's basically $5 billion worth of sidewalk need. We're not getting that from a $1.5 billion levy. And so there's that gap. And so looking at, can we bond things? Are there additional grants? I don't know about that anymore with the federal government, but are there ways to get that funding through bonding to really start to chip away at some of the sidewalk funding pieces? Because a lot of it comes down to there just not being the resources. I think there's also then the questions of what we do with existing right-of-way and the conflicts that occur. But I have really appreciated how much work has happened in the last year or so of really trying to reduce car speeds in Seattle. There's a lot of speed humps going up. And I've noticed in my neighborhood, I think that can make our streets more accessible and safer for a lot of folks. So that's a hopeful thing. But happy to talk more about specific projects or questions too later.
Your book mentioned the Denver Deserves Sidewalks campaign. Do you know if that has worked out well yet?
Last I heard, they were also running up into issues with funding. So I think there was a lot of excitement about, so for Denver decided they were struggling like Seattle does with missing sidewalks and sidewalk repair. The scale of their problem, and I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's smaller. Like the total amount of money they needed was less. But they passed a levy in Denver to really address that problem, and to, rather than having it be the individual property owner's responsibility to fix sidewalks, for the city to assume that responsibility. I think they're still trying to figure out the costs, and because of inflation, I think some of those increased costs are putting some strain on that, is what I've heard, but I haven't heard the latest. But I'm also, if you want to talk to the Denver folks, I'm happy to put you in touch with them. They're great, and they worked really hard to move the sidewalk conversation forward. I think in most of our country, unless you're in the weeds, this isn't something you think about, but sidewalks are the responsibility of the adjacent property owner, pretty much, well, in Washington state by state law. And so a city can come in and repair that, but they're not necessarily getting funding from the property owner to do that, at least not in Seattle. And there's not a funding structure to do it. So how do we set it up so that, we have the city come in and repave our streets? Why aren't we thinking about sidewalks in the same ways? Because imagine, if we were trying to, if it was up to the individual property owner to repair potholes, what that would be like. And that's what it's like with our sidewalks.
There are some already stated steps to improving transit and access to transit for people with disabilities, but how would you improve transit access and effectiveness for children and teens without a license?
I think a lot of this is changing our culture around transit, and so does some of the stigma and fear around the bus. And I recognize that buses are not always comfortable places to be right now. My kid was bear sprayed on a bus in Seattle. I wasn't with him when it happened, but that was traumatic. It still is traumatic. And so, I think part of it is, how do we make transit a place that more people are more often, and have that sort of shared space? I feel like my experience living in New York for so long was that the subways felt very safe. And that's because there were just so many people always there using them. And it's a complicated balance, but I do think having that expectation that it's just normal to ride the train or ride the bus, and that kids can do it independently, in middle school, that's huge. But also just the culture of parents being willing to do it with their kids. I know on my own block, sometimes, so our school bus stop last year was the same as the King County Metro stop, and the King County Metro bus actually went faster to the school than the school bus. And so when the school bus was running really late in the morning, I would offer, if it was my day to walk the kids to the school bus, I would offer to just take them into school. And at first, I think there was a little bit of fear and trepidation from the other
parents on the block about riding the bus. And none of the other kids had been on the bus before. And when they got to be on the bus, they were so excited about it. They're like, this is so cool, let's do this. So every morning then, because usually we'd be sitting there waiting for the school bus would be late, and there'd be like 2 or 3 7 buses that would pass us as we're waiting, and they would beg me, to ride the bus. So I think kids are excited about riding the bus, and how can we make that just sort of more part of our culture? I think for an example of a group that's doing great work around sort of that culture shift around transit is Move Redmond. They are a great, they do a lot of work around encouraging transit use and making it fun. So finding those places. One other just example of making it fun. Intercity Transit down in Olympia has a bus ride-along program for kids where they like sing Wheels on the Bus, and then they take the bus through a bus car wash, like a bus wash. Yeah, which I haven't done this yet, but it's on like my bucket list of things to do. And I was trying to get King County Metro to do it, but apparently our bus washes, like, they can't do it. Whatever, it's not going to happen up here. But down in Olympia, there is this awesome program, and it gets, kids who doesn't want to go through a bus wash on a bus. So, yeah, it does sound really fun.
A totally different kind of cultural change. How do you see services like Uber and Lyft working with transit?
Yeah. This one is tricky. When Uber and Lyft first sort of came on the scene, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because I was traveling a lot for work. I was living in New York at that point. And my experience of traveling places was I'd get to an airport, like, I don't know, somewhere in Ohio, and I would try to call the cab company, and like there would be no cab company, or it would take like 2 hours for them to show up. And then suddenly, like, I could get an Uber and a Lyft anywhere in the country. And that was really transformative. And it was also really cheap. Irrationally cheap. It was not the real cost, right? I wasn't paying that cost. And I started kind of abusing it. Like, I missed a train once from Hartford back to New York City, and it was like a 3-hour train ride. And I just booked an Uber because it was cheaper, which, like, shouldn't be the case. Yeah. So, and now, now we're starting to pay more of the real costs. It is much. During the pandemic, it became almost impossible, right, in places to get Ubers. In Tacoma, I know it's just like you could not get one. I would try to go there for work sometimes, and I'd take the bus there and then get off the bus, and there would be no way to get to like the person's house I was trying to get to. So yeah, I think now the conversation is, there's the piece of whether we want to be subsidizing that as, public agencies. I don't think we should. I don't think it's a sustainable model. And I think there's the issue of scale too, right? Like, it may work, for some rides in some rural places. And this is true of sort of on-demand transit more broadly, like Metro Flex. But if you're really trying to get a lot of people to use a service, it doesn't scale to do that, drop off, pick off. Individual routes. And so I really hope we can think more about how do we create networks that actually can scale, that are affordable and that can expand as the service, improves, versus as the service improves with these other things, it can expand. And so either the price has to go up or, the service just has to get worse, which has been, I think you guys have some version of Metroflex up here. I know in my part of Seattle we have it, and it's, as more people are wanting to use it, the wait times are, it's 45 minutes. So unless I'm carrying something that I like absolutely cannot carry, it's not worth it, right? Because you can walk to the light rail in 15 minutes, right? So why would you wait an hour? And it says an hour, and then it's actually an hour and a half. Like, the unreliability of it has been frustrating for me. So, I'll just add one more piece. Because I always get this question, autonomous vehicles, and like, is that the solution? And again, I think it's a question of scale and what kind of communities we want to live in. And, even and when that technology sort of exists and works, will it be affordable for the people who need it most? Will it be in the places that we need it, like, in rural areas or places where it's not perhaps as profitable to run, but where there are non-drivers? And then, in places where, in cities, will it create more of the kind of things that we don't want, right? Like, will it induce us to live further apart? Will it induce us to spend more time in cars? Will it then, as a result of that sort of land use change, get harder and harder to go places outside of a vehicle. And so I think we really need to be careful about embracing it as the future, because we need to be thinking about, okay, what kind of future do we actually want? It might be a stopgap for access needs in the present for some people, but I'm not sure it's going to get us to where we want to go.
What is being done by the community to replace the transit that was taken away?
I'm guessing this is in the context of the pandemic and routes getting cut with Metro. Yeah, probably. I mean, and just to sort of big picture it, like, so I graduated high school in 2001. And the last sort of thing I was doing in high school was working on an anti-Tim Eyman initiative, the car tabs initiative. Yeah. And as a result of that passing, right, we lost massive amounts of transit funding. And transit agencies all over the state had huge cuts. And it does sort of feel like, to me, some of the work that's happening now with Climate Commitment Act dollars and with, you know, some of the federal transit investments from the from building back, you know, from COVID funding has started to rebuild transit, especially in more rural areas of our state, in a way that hasn't really been there since, you know, the pre-Tim Eyman era. Yeah, with King County Metro, you know, I think we need more ridership and we need more funding. And I think there is the question of, you know, where do you prioritize service? Yeah, because a lot of the commuter routes that, you know, formerly I think served the east side, that ridership really decreased, and ridership retained, retained in a lot of the South King County routes and west, you know, southwest King County. And so those shifts have in service have shifted as well. But King County, I mean, there's lots of ways to engage, and I know they're continuing to do route planning. And I think there's also, I guess the other part of it, I know there's been a lot of route shifting with the light rail. And I know how frustrating, I mean, what I've heard from folks is as the light rail expands, right, routes that used to go into downtown Seattle are now ending, right, in Linwood or in Northgate. And it becomes a longer trip for some folks, for a lot of folks, and that's hard. And I really do think when we've seen how much light rail goes down, we need multiple routes. And I think the beauty of how, like, why New York City works is that there are so many parallel routes. So if when one line has a problem, there's other lines you can usually get on, or bus lines, right? And here we're sort of funneling everything into this one thing, and then if it doesn't work, we're kind of screwed. So, you know, how can we keep these? And again, it's a funding question, but how do we keep multiple routes so you can get, you know, you have choices if one system isn't working?
I'm going to combine the next two questions because I think they're related. Are there any examples of small to medium-sized U.S. cities that you believe have done an exemplary job of creating a community that is great for non-drivers? And also, are there any cities that you admire in terms of their public transit infrastructure?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I've gotten this question a lot, and I'm like, I want to move there. I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, different cities have different strengths. I think there's places that have done really great work with trails and biking access that don't have great transit. I lived in Tucson, Arizona for a while, and you know, there is a bus network there. It's not particularly well funded, but there are a lot of, you know, there's a lot of bike infrastructure there. Fort Collins, Colorado, amazing bike infrastructure. Oh my gosh, and beautiful. Madison, Wisconsin, again, like great transit. I think Minneapolis has done a lot. Not a small city, but no, I think there's different strengths. I do think King County, I mean, we do have, you know, a great transit network, all things considered. And so, you know, sometimes it's hard to remember that when it does feel, I guess, you know, having lived in New York, I would say New York City, there's a difference. Like you sort of reach this tipping point when most people don't drive ever, where suddenly like you look up, you know, directions to a doctor's office and there's only transit directions. It's like on these lines. Right? Or here you look up a doctor's office and it's like, here's our parking garage and here's the exit off I-5. And so there just becomes, you know, I think that is something that doesn't happen in many places, and it is a privilege, right? Those places tend to be really expensive places to live. So that's hard.
Do you have recommendations for ways to advocate for a crosswalk or additional bus stop that would improve access to public transit for a high-needs community?
Yeah, I mean, I do think video is a powerful tool here, especially if you can show a situation that's really unsafe or, you know, uncomfortable. And so, you know, that can be a powerful tool. and then figuring out how to, have that highlighted through social media or media, and then connecting with advocacy groups. And this might be a perfect tie-in for your all's work here and what you're doing, because a lot of this is local activism and building those relationships with elected leaders that understand, why this matters, and understand that there are people in the community who really need those safe crossings or that access. So thank you. I'm going to turn it. Yeah, I'm happy. I'm happy to answer more questions individually or sign books if you have a copy. I'll also say the book is available at King County Libraries. I've heard that there are copies available, so you can check it out there.
Great. So after hearing so much about transportation and disability and the ways that these things impact the non-drivers in our community, you might be feeling so inspired to get involved. And we have many ways, suggested ways for you to get involved. One of them is through Accessibility Seattle. If you are interested in learning more about how to make environments accessible, whether that's in tech or built environments or transportation, check out Accessibility Seattle. We have meetups, we have tech talks, we have a Discord and a book club. If you are interested in becoming a member or an ally of disability in tech professionals in the disability community, check out Disability Connect. They have major gatherings, panel discussions, breakouts, and networking for people with disabilities in the tech community. And now I will hand it over to Bev to tell you ways to get involved more locally here in Kirkland. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Just a couple of things. One of the key, really handy ways to get involved is to learn what's going on is to subscribe to the City of Kirkland email list. It's really just a great way to stay involved. And I want to highlight a handful of those lists. City Council, Planning Commission, and Transportation Commission lists, which provide meeting agendas, materials, recordings, the comprehensive plan update list, and This Week in Kirkland, which provides an overview of what's going on in the city each week. To see what other topics may pique your interest and involvement, you can check out the subscription list page. It's a long URL, but if you go to the city website, I'm sure you'll find it. Again, that's a great way to learn about what's going on in the city and really ways to start getting involved and going to meetings and just understand what's going on and what's going on specifically with some of the issues that were addressed tonight. And secondly, I want to circle back to Liveable Kirkland's community activities, the activities that Jenny mentioned in her introductory remarks. I want to note the various ways that you can connect with us. We have a newsletter, we have an event calendar, we have a Facebook group, we have a Discord server, and we have meetup groups. So please see our website to learn more about activities and to join our activities. So with that, I hope you are inspired to become a little more active if something piqued your interest. And this ends the formal part of our presentation. Please feel free to mingle, to chat. There are a lot of cookies over there, and visit our information tables. Our cleanup starts at 6, so we still have time, and the doors lock promptly at 7. I want to again give a big thanks to our presenter, Anna Zivarts. Thank you. Our volunteers, many of you have come out. Thank you so much. Our audience members have been terrific with all your questions and engagement. And to the City of Kirkland for providing the venue, the technical support, and of course the cookies. So again, and thank you all. Thank you.